Alison Bentley. I lead the genetics and breeding work here at NIAB, and my focus is on crop genetic improvement.
And I'm Helen Anne Curry. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge, and my specialty is in looking at the history of plant breeding, genetics, agricultural science in the 20th century and beyond.
Right. And I'm Martin Jones, and I'm an archaeologist of food, so I look at very old bits of wheat and other foods in ancient bonfires and places like that, and I also work a bit with genetics and stuff. And one of the things that's happened as I've thought about wheat and looked at wheat in the archaeological record for many years, is I've started thinking of this wheat behind us as more of an artefact than a plant. I mean, to me it's as much of an artefact as a temple or a pyramid, and if I think of it as a plant, I think it's actually quite monstrous, quite clumsy, and it needs a lot of attention. If I contrast it with this is what 8,000 to 10,000 years ago a Neolithic farmer would farm. It's also wheat. It's a different species of wheat. It hasn't got the same number of chromosomes. But I look at that and I think, no, that's a well-designed grass. It's the next generation. Its grains, its offspring, are nicely protected in very tight chaff and protected against birds and fungi. It breaks up nicely and has these awns to guide the grains into the soil. So the Neolithic farmer, although they did tend these plots, if they had to take their sheep over the mountain for a few weeks, they could leave this alone and it could look after itself, unlike this one that needs looking after all the time. And if we come, there's one in the middle actually. Now, the wheat behind us has been one of the world's most important crops for about 1,500 years, but the wheat that's had a much longer run is this one. So all kind of prehistoric civilizations, Egyptian society and so forth, worked on this one. This is called Emma wheat, and it's got twice as many chromosomes as the last one, but only 2/3 as much as the one behind us. And it's still quite nicely designed. It still partly breaks up, and it protects its grain in the chaff and has these lovely awns and so forth. And you can start to understand now that when I look at the wheat behind, it looks a bit clumsy. The grains are half falling out of the chaff, hasn't got its awns. It needs constant attention, terribly thirsty, terribly hungry. So that's why I kind of think of this wheat as a bit of an artifact, a bit of a monster.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because I think the connotation of artifact is also that it's an invention. This is something that humans created. And when I think about wheat, from my perspective as a historian, one of the things that I think about is that modern wheat varieties are inventions that have had a lot of political effects, that they have social impact, right? And so it matters what kinds of wheat, what varieties we invent and put out there in the world. And there's an example that's actually really relevant, since we're sitting here in the National Institute of Agricultural Botany, which was founded in the 1920s here in Britain, in part based on the success of a couple of wheat varieties that were developed by a breeder here in Cambridge who was working with what was then the Plant Breeding Institute. And so it was his ability to develop better varieties of wheat. There was one called Little Joss and one called Yeoman that gathered attention to how the science of genetics could create better crop plants, and then really helped convince the British government that it should be putting funding into something like plant breeding, that was significant enough to construct institutes and put resources towards it on a continuing basis. And so a particular wheat variety could have some kind of power in terms of bringing scientists into new positions of authority and control. So it's really interesting to think of them as individual inventions in that way, and the kinds of effects that they can have.
I think it leads really nicely into the work that goes on today, which is really focused on how we can kind of continue this evolution of these starting varieties that came out of the Plant Breeding Institute, and how research can contribute to kind of just continuing this creation of the monster to an ever bigger and kind of greater and wider reaching monster. And we're really focused on the yield of these crops and how we can maximize those. But as you say, Martin, these are very hungry and thirsty crops. And we rely on them almost exclusively, with a few other major crops, to provide the calorific needs of, the global population. And the research is really focused on how do we kind of continue this increase and this advance of this thing that was created or invented to serve that purpose, and with the political kind of social implications of that.
Actually, Alison, you raise a very interesting point about diversity, because one of the things that brings to mind is if I look back to those, 5,000 to 10,000 year old archaeological wheats, the wheats aren't alone. They might be grown alongside 5 or 6 other cereals in the same single farm. And the other thing that's quite interesting is that if you can get a chance to say, within this species of wheat, how uniform is it, how variable is it, I would think it's much less uniform than the stand of modern wheat behind us. So if we wandered into a field 5,000 years ago, there'd be differences in height, differences in grain density, differences in colour, and
well, and I think that trajectory that you've just outlined of going from greater diversity to lesser diversity to more uniformity is something that we can think of as happening in stages, right? There's a decision to focus on the grass that is, or that becomes wheat, right? And certain species related to it. But then there's also, in the 20th century, a narrowing even of the varieties that we use, right? So it's not just focusing on particular species, but then on particular strains within that species. And that is something that happens here in Britain with the professionalization of breeding and seed production in the early 20th century. And it's really something that starts to happen worldwide in the 1950s and 60s with the development of what are called widely adapted varieties that can grow and thrive in a variety of different environmental contexts. And then there's a point at which we start to see wheat varieties that are, for example, bred in Mexico becoming grown in India or Pakistan, and really a kind of global change in which uniformity. So it's not just the 5,000 year difference, but also the 50-year change.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that these programs, so the CIMMYT program based out of Mexico, serves this huge area. It's a great vehicle for creating material which is widely adapted to multiple regions. But these are farmers farming very diverse environments and using these varieties which are adapted to produce a harvestable yield over 45 million hectares. These are very widely adapted varieties compared to what the situation was in history, where you had kind of regional specialization, all this diversification within it. And I think that brings us to this question of how would the food production evolve if we didn't have wheat. So I don't know, Martin, do you have kind of thoughts on how the system could move forward into the future?
Well, my own view is that although I've been rather negative about the wheats behind us, the thing they do really well is put on biomass, and there are a small number of plants in the world that can put on biomass like what I've rather been derogatory about as a clumsy, monstrous plant. And so that is something that is going to be an important element, whatever we do. The question is how much we need to spread, hedge our bets, if you like, how much we need to how much we need to spread the risk. I mean, if we were talking about a financial portfolio, we wouldn't put everything into stocks and shares that might kind of really maximize all the time. We'd have some stocks and shares, some bonds, and a bit of a mix. And one thing I'm not sure about is whether we've got the mix right at the moment. Another thing I think one can look at history for is, as you say, on different timescales, including very recent timescales, we can see the potential for supercrops like wheat to put on more biomass. And if you put against that the evidence of hunger in the world, it's not simply going down as the crops go up. And I don't want to be kind of nostalgically, put a nostalgic gloss over the past. If one looks at deep history, there are disasters, there are famines. It's not all rosy in the past, but nonetheless, one can see over the course of human history, diversifying it has been an important risk mitigation process. And for the reasons that you've, these very interesting points you're making, you've been talking about the last 50 years, really homing into to a narrow base. And we're now at the stage where over 50% of the energy coming into the human food chain comes down to 3 plants, one of which is wheat and the other 2 are maize or corn and rice. So there's an interesting question, I think, there about whether the mix, not whether this doesn't remain a central part of what we do. It's whether we've got the mix right, I think.
And whether that allows us to sustain the future food security needs of the hungry people.
Absolutely, yeah.